We are moving right along. As I said to you at the beginning this morning, today is all about doing better, right? These incremental gains at better retailing, better insights, better machine learning, etc. And we're next going to talk about making better decisions. So much of what makes the world of AI exciting is the idea and the belief that we can make better decisions either through AI or alongside AI, kind of linking back to our first conversation this morning with Olivier Sibony. So we wanted to have a session dedicated to this topic in particular, how to make better decisions through AI. So I'm going to pass it over to Emily. Emily, I'll find you soon for our next discussion. I'm just pulling from the bookshelf while you get ready, Emily.
Good morning again. So today we're going to be, right now we're going to be talking about better decisions, and we're going to be talking to Nuala Walsh. Nuala is joining us from Dublin. She's an award-winning non-executive director, behavioral scientist, TEDx speaker, and author. She's named among the 100 most influential women in finance, and she spent the last 3 decades in investment management at BlackRock, Merrill Lynch, and Standard Life Aberdeen as Chief Marketing Officer. Today, she's CEO of MindEquity and founding director of the Global Association of Behavioral Scientists. She advises on behavioral change, culture, and reputation. Her recent book, Tune In, which we have here, right? Yeah. Is all about how to make smarter decisions in a noisy world, which will be at the heart of our conversation today. Welcome, Nuala.
Thank you very much, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to see you, Nuala. How are things in Dublin?
Excellent.
Good.
Excellent. No
we
complaints.
didn't know where you'd join us from. If you'd be from London or from Dublin today. Well, we had you here in Paris. It's pretty sunny for now, but we are locked in the studio, so we're none the wiser. So, Nuala, in the book, you talk about some what you call kind of structural traps that can lead to humans making bad decisions, or maybe I should say less ideal decisions. Can you talk us through a few of them?
Sure. And I think, Ted, it's probably worth stepping back just a little,
Sure.
Maybe to put the overall traps in context. And you probably know or remember that the World Economic Forum predicted that misinformation is going to be the #1 risk facing the world in the next few years. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is that nobody talks about this information of the mind. And as behavioral scientists, we know that, at the end of the day, context and cognition fuse. We decide in a noisy world that's overloaded with data, distraction, disinformation we've just heard about for the last couple of hours. Yep. And that makes us much more short-term, binary and instinctive than ever. So of the 200 plus biases that we hear about, and the number is growing, of course, yep, I've distilled these in 75 of these into 10 common traps, and each of about 7 or 8 that impact decision-making. Now, these are all interrelated and they vary in intensity. So I've summarized these in the mnemonic perimeters, and the word has been deliberately selected because it reflects Herbert Simon's idea that we think in a bounded, limited way that skews our reasoning. We tune out, in other words, and the consequences are pervasive. We read about them in the papers every day. The miscarriages of justice, misconduct, failed M&A, missed Ponzi schemes. It's a very, very long list. And I think yesterday we heard about even how many cancer deaths are preventable. So the perimeters frame is going to be very useful to people, to behavioral scientists, to their clients, to the organizations, and to individuals in 3 ways. They optimize decisions in real time. They diagnose the past to prevent future error. So what I'm going to do is basically just have a quick look at these traps at a high level, bearing in mind that there is actually a full chapter on each trap. So maybe if you think about a decision that you're going to make, quite a high stakes decision really, and ask yourself as we go through these 10 very quickly, how might your judgment be impacted by any of these dimensions, bearing in mind that each one of these has 7 or 8 different biases associated. So the first one is power traps, and these multiple power traps occur when we obsessively chase goals and narrow focus. So when you crave power early career, we know that people obey bosses, idols, and experts in the authority bias. But when you elevate these people, you relinquish your personal power against your best interests. Conformity bias sets in, But when you get to the end of your career, or even midway, you might think that you're going to lose your job. You fear losing power, job or your status. Misjudgment sets in and people get desperate. And a great example of this is probably Donald Trump in the January 6th Capitol Hill riots. Yeah. So we misjudge when we want power, we crave power, we're desperate to hold on to power, either as a professional, a professor, or a president. The next set of traps are the ego-based traps, and they're it's the most dangerous three-letter word, if you like, and they're sort of self-explanatory. When you crave recognition to an unhealthy level, and you're committed to your own voice over anybody else. So it's the narcissist, the humble bragger, or the average Joe. The danger here is, of course, that belief bias becomes overconfidence or the illusion of invulnerability. We think it'll never happen to us, but of course it does happen. And we saw with OceanGate, the CEO of OceanGate last year with the Titan, he ignored the voice of 38 different experts and compromised safety standards. And unfortunately, the catastrophe of the Titan, materialized. So people do this not realizing that actually, it does have serious consequences beyond those in just an organization. So the problem, I guess, is that these communicate or lead to risk-based traps where you underweight or overweight risk. So this is all about intolerance, uncertainty, and probability neglect, loss aversion, anchoring, commitment escalation, all the ones that you probably would be familiar with. So you've got the classic case of Steve Jobs. He miscalculated his medical risk, of course. You drive too fast. Sunbed users think they're not going to get cancer. It's a very long list, and I think people are probably familiar with that. Then you have the category called identity-based traps, and these are very interesting because you make decisions to impress your in-group, and you curate labels. Everybody wants a certain title. You want to be the best, the first, the fastest, the most senior. And we make bad choices to get there, whether it's about spending, shortcuts, etc. And there are many examples, particularly here you've got the in-group biases, and in-groups tune out the out-groups, of course. But when your religious, sporting, national, or political identity is fixed, consistency and change of mind becomes a trap. And the next category, I thought it's quite a difficult category, are the memory-based traps, because we all think our memory is perfect, and we want it to be. But when you're a brand and you overtrust customers or employees to accurately recall, you invest and waste a huge amount of money. I mean, it's recall bias, but we forget that we only retain 25% of what we hear, and availability bias, of course, means that we only recount what we hear. And the power of suggestion and the misinformation effect comes into here and affects everything from anywhere from the boardroom to the courtroom. And then the ethics traps probably need not very much explanation. You can't resist temptation. You don't do the right thing, or you compromise doing the right thing. That is all about the slippery slope, ethical fading, moral disengagement, and the result is Ponzi schemes, the opioid crisis, rogue traders. And a factor that plays here are the temporal-based traps, and we know about temporal discounting, and when you overweight the past, the present, or the future and become short-term. So this is about hindsight bias and status quo bias and present bias. And Wall Street is littered with firms that are quite literally stuck in the past. And only this week we saw bankrupt Tupperware and Harland and Wolff. So again, these traps combine, and you start to see a pattern that it's not just one. Any scenario, any scandal, any mistake can be explained by a combination of these. And it's a very interesting thing to do, to actually analyze any of these incidents that take place. Emotion, of course, underpins everything we do. Road rage, hate crimes, temper, pride, etc. And wishful thinking, the ostrich effect, regret aversion, all come into play here. So it's important, because we have 27 emotions, to think about which ones get in your way and which ones help you on your way. And then you have the relationship-based traps, which are the crowd-based herding, groupthink, social relativity. And at the end of the day, we all want to belong, but the mistakes and the judgments that we make are often predicated on that and the intensity of the desire to follow popular opinion. So all of these are, to a behavioural scientist, probably self-evident. But to the average person who hasn't studied all of these, they aren't. And it's really critical that people have a better understanding of these in order to avoid predictable error. And the story-based traps, again, this is about the social, political, or organizational narrative that people consider. And you have the messenger effect. And this goes back to everybody from Santa Claus, to the Salem witch trials or conspiracy theories. But they're very, very evident because I think it's the one where confirmation bias particularly comes into effect. All are interrelated, all are evident in everything from M&A to investments to strategy, to political decisions. And what I've tried to do with these is to map all of these. It's never just one, it's usually an interplay of several. But what's underpinning all of these is what I've called the trilogy of error. And it comes from Daniel Kahneman's, what you see is all there is, which we're familiar with, the idea of blind spots. And as I went through this research, and quite extensive research, the thought of tuning out in a polarized world, we don't hear what really matters, we only hear the voices that really suit us, etc. We don't hear all there is, and we really don't. And there are many different reasons why that's the case. So compounded by that, you have then, of course, dumb spots, which is what you say is not all there is. And each of these causes us to misjudge what we see, what we hear, and what we say, literally and figuratively. All are a source of misinformation. And the book is, of course, predicated on deaf spots as lethal judgment killers, with many examples, and some of the biases really do play into that, which we can maybe touch on later. And it does remind me of the 16th century Japanese maxim, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. That just occurred to me as I was doing the work. But this 3D perspective, I think, is really important and really helpful for people in terms of making judgment calls. So, of course, opportunity exists, and we have what I've called the sonic strategies. Again, making it easy and simple for people to remember how you can mitigate these biases. There are 18. Some of them will be familiar to people. It starts with slowing down, to enable yourself to challenge your thinking, to organize your attention so that you're actually in the best position that you can make these decisions. You navigate novel perspectives so that you don't rush to judgment. You interrupt your mindset, yours and other people's and your team's, so that you don't assume the validity of what you hear. And then, of course, you calibrate, situations, strangers, and strategies, so you help get these decisions right. And each of these contains all of these, scientifically proven examples. And, we don't have time now, but I did think that, if people are interested, there is an opportunity, that there is a huge amount of detail in all of these misjudgment tools. So feel free to scan it now if people are interested in more detail, both in optimizing decisions, but also the counter problem of minimizing indecision, if they're so inclined. And again, this is based on over 500 different scientific references and over 75 different biases in the TED Talk. So speaking of TED, yes. I hope that sufficiently answers your question, Ted.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to that, Nuala. So, you've called the book Tune In, and you've talked to us a little bit, you've kind of introduced the idea of deaf spots, but what do you mean precisely by tuning in? I'm an ex-journalist, so I want to kind of push you on terminology, and we've asked our crowd today, we're only halfway through day one, we're asking people if they're tuned in or tuned out, and they are claiming they are tuned in, 95% of them, Nuala, if you can see that on your screen. But define for us, what is tuned in? Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me, Ted, that people say that they're 95% tuned in, because actually 90% of us also think that we're not biased, and I think 96% of people think that they're great listeners and good decision makers too. So it doesn't surprise me. The difference between tuned in and tuned out is this error that I talked about just a moment ago. I'm going to start with tuning out first, because tuning out shows up in seemingly harmless ways. We take things at face value. You don't second guess information. You don't probe sources like data, yourselves or other people. You hear what you want to hear, or something that makes us feel good about ourselves. We tune out doubt, dissent, inconvenient truth, and that, it can be the voice of, infidelity or poor performance or bad feedback or medical news or whatever. And on the contrary, we tune in fake news, scandals, extremism, gossip. Tuning in selectively and strategically is the solution to the problem. You can't tune in everything, because we've heard about neuroscience. We know that we have a 25% processing limitation in terms of what we can actually process. So when we tune in selectively, we don't hear those voices of comfort and convenience, but you hear the voice of conscience or common sense. You hear the manipulators, the hidden meaning in what people are saying. You look for the nuance, you look for the anomalies. You don't just discount the dissenters or the mavericks or the minorities. And so if I give you an example maybe of the airline industry in a very practical way. So if you consider the example of tuning out versus tuning in, faced with a strike. So you probably remember, Captain Sullenberger and the US Airways flight that saved 155 passengers by landing on the Hudson River. For me, that's an example of somebody who tuned into the voice of experience. And, it could have gone either way. And in contrast, you've many examples, but the one that struck me at the time of writing was in the dense fog, Kobe Bryant's pilot, Aras O'Brien, he was desperate, and the research supports this, and the investigation reports suggest that he was desperate to appease his client. He underestimated the fog. He tuned out because he wanted to please the client and get there. And now there were other factors too, but at the end of the day, this is about judgment. And this is one pilot's judgment over another. And it underscores the importance of tuning in and tuning out the voice of experience. And I mentioned the OceanGate CEO earlier on as well. This is about knowing who to tune in and who to tune out. And of course, nobody is fully tuned in or always tuned in, and neither should they be. But when you hold power and when you influence other people's lives, it really does matter who you hear and who you don't.
Yeah. Well, I think the concept of tuning in and tuning out is intuitive once you've explained it. But what got you started on this topic? Is it your experience in the banking and finance sector? Was it your experience in working in marketing and communications? What got you so focused on this to take something that, I think people can understand quite intuitively, but to bring it to this depth? What was the impetus of the idea?
Yeah, to be honest, I was 30 years in financial services. It wasn't particularly that, Ted. When I left and I did a master's at the London School of Economics, I learned the ability to label all of these biases. And I learned the power of being able to understand behavior. When you're able to explain what people do and what they don't do in these terms, and biases are very glitzy, marketing kind of labels, and they're easy to understand, it makes it easier to avoid mistakes. And what I was particularly attracted to, and I saw it everywhere, and that's why the book deliberately talks about astronauts, presidents, serial killers, parents, professors. Absolutely everybody falls victim to these. And the problem goes back to these, and I wanted to draw attention to the deaf spots. So Tim Levine talks about our default to truth, that we automatically suppress doubt and ignore the anomalies, so we don't imagine the worst case scenarios. But this default to honesty and tuning out selectively creates a number of vulnerabilities. And the first one is our susceptibility to deception. So we assume people are truthful. So it makes us great targets for a con artist, a scammer, or the fraudster. So we're more likely to be deceived by Madoff's Ponzi scheme or a retail manipulator. Or we overlook red flags in these whistleblowing examples. So Larry Nassar, the former gymnast, who abused athletes for years, people tuned him out, even though they were told. And similarly, Tony Blair tuned into the false intelligence about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Because people take information at face value. They accept the spin, the praise, the rumor, or the gist without explanation. And we don't reinterpret what we're told. So this isn't about listening. It's about reinterpreting what we're told. And, I do give the example about the Catholic Church example, but also lots of legal cases. Amanda Knox, the Italian jury in that case, tuned out. But there are lots of examples of jurors and juries that basically make this rush to judgment, and they make their decisions in the early stages. 74% do not change their views despite all the evidence that is presented for confirmation bias and other reasons. But the impact on this, it's not just on yourself, it's on other people and it's on society. So in my career, I didn't always read the signals. I chose the more favorable interpretations. Once upon a time, I was called tone deaf. 30 years later, I write a book called Tune In. Somewhere along the line, I'm sure there's something in there. But when you see tone deaf leadership now in a polarized world, presidents, CEOs, doctors, lawyers, it's a real problem, especially when you see the consequences and the multiplication effect on other people, whether you're, no matter what role you hold. And in today's world, you're cancelled if you don't respect these diverse opinions and you're tuned out, and you have employees who feel unheard, you have citizens who feel unheard, you have a huge proportion of the electorate in the US now not willing to vote, not able to vote. 53% of people, leaders, according to a HSBC study only the other day, say that they are unable to make a decision because of this, constant noise and so many voices. Which one do you really pick? It is a real problem, and it's an underestimated problem.
And so, Nuala, you talk about how one of the benefits of tuning in is in your book, How to Make Smarter Decisions. Can you give us a bit, maybe some less obvious benefits of what tuning in can look like?
Yeah, and it's a great question. At the end of the day, judgment is at a premium because of all of this. So we know that. I think tuning in can help at a couple of different levels. At an individual level, you earn more money. It's that basic. So at the end of the day, you're paid to listen. Whether you're an analyst, a therapist, a planner, a journalist, or a consultant, you are paid to listen to the other person, to people. You're paid to get decisions right. You are actually rewarded. You are 12 times more likely to become a CEO if you make better, quicker, smarter decisions. So from an individual, you avoid not just personal regret, you avoid reputation damage by not listening, by making misjudgment calls. So your salary does depend on that. So at a very basic level, it does affect your income. If you're an organization, yes, you also have the reputation risk, but you also have survivability. So the average business life cycle has now reduced. It's gone from 61 years to 18 years. And as I said earlier, well-known brands disappear. So there are many examples. If this is about understanding who to tune in and tune out, helps you know when to leave. So we had Joe Biden recently, who, to be fair, was faced with a huge decision. Which voice did he tune into and tune out? So understanding this helps people know what's right and what's wrong. And from a societal perspective, it's not just about better decisions. It's about tuning in to hear different voices. So of course you would have, fewer riots, fewer strikes, less activism, at an employee or a customer level, and less social discord. So, when I speak to clients, I think it's pretty obvious, how oblivious they are to this risk. And Ted, you mentioned earlier that people think they're all tuned in. I mean, there is the evidence. Yeah. But in industry, people prize logical over psychological, and Rory Sutherland has talked about this many times, and it's absolutely right. People overweight the economic, the political, and the market risk, but never decision risk. And at the end of the day, this costs the average Fortune 500 company 250 million a year, and I think that's a very conservative estimate. So the real winners are the people, and this is a Cherokee proverb that I particularly like, talks about listening to the whispers, and then you don't have to hear the screams. It's the basis of prevention is better than cure. Mm-hmm. So for me, when you do tune in, it is about gaining advantage, hearing things that other people just don't hear. So from a business perspective, you hear more, you hear differently, you hear better, and I think you gain a massive advantage against those people who sometimes are just so arrogant that they think they know the answers. So they don't bother to listen, and they miss the nuance and they miss real meaning.
Yeah. Well, maybe on the flip side, are there decisions that you think we make pretty well, even if we're halfway hearing or a little bit tuned out? Are there times, you said before, we can't be tuned in all the time. It's cognitively effortful. It takes a lot. Are there times or decisions where you think people are actually pretty good operating in a kind of lizard brain, walking through their paces?
Well, definitely. Of course, the routine decisions don't, it's low consequence versus high consequence. And I think it's important when you ask that question to categorize the decision. And there are so many decisions. How do you actually categorize the decisions? That's another book for somebody else. But, whether it's strategic or tactical, individual or group, high or low involvement, I think it helps to ask some basic questions. Are you being proactive or reactive? Are you using intuition or a scenario model? Are you in crisis? So obviously tuning in, matters for high stakes decisions when the consequences are significant or long term or affecting many people. I'm not sure your lizard brain, you might be a fireman and it helps, but when the decision involves novelty, uncertainty and risk, it's important to tune in differently, reflection, etc. So the question, is about the ability to reinterpret what you hear. And we mentioned earlier about it's important to tune into the relevant voices, and that's not as easy as it sounds. You might rely on an expert, a lawyer or a doctor in a novel situation, but their perspective may be limited, or you're not going to ask Usain Bolt for, investment tips, or you seek your friends in a crisis rather than the objective person who's going to give you a diverse opinion, a better opinion, or a different opinion. But no, we rush to the familiar in-group, and so it's when you do that, it's important to recognize who you tune in, but also who you should tune out. So it's easy to recognize who you should tune out, and that is the first voice you hear, the loudest voice you hear in a meeting, and we all have had that, the most senior voice, because we all assume that senior is right, which they're not, the most familiar voice, as I said already, the friend is not always the right person, the most popular person, the idol, or the expert. We all do it. These dominate our decision making, but they are not always their best insight. So the book is a call to people to say, just think a little bit differently. Just ask yourself the question, why am I listening to this person? Is it my agenda? Is it their agenda? What are they really saying? You can't do it all the time, or you'd never get anything done. But for a high stakes decision that matters to you, or that has consequences for other people, I think it's really, really important. And I think it's our moral duty and responsibility to do so.
Great.
I have one more question for you. So today, obviously, the focus of Human Advantage is on artificial intelligence. It's our AI day. How would you say that tuning in can relate to AI? What's the link between the two?
It's a great question, Emily. I actually think they're very much related, because tone-deaf leadership is caused by AI in the first instance, data overload. We overtrust it. We think it's got the answer. And it triggers that rush to judgment that epitomizes tuning out. We tune out when we're too busy. So what do? We go to ChatGPT. A marvelous starting point. And what we tend to do is we confuse the speed of decision making with the skill of decision making. So, or the volume of data with the value of data. And I think, as we heard from Olivier earlier about judgment, using AI doesn't give you any immunity from misjudgment. It exacerbates judgment killers. And, he talked about the Amazon hiring tool, the discriminating against candidates. Apple also had another, card gender algorithm that discriminated for credit card applicants. But there was another one that I picked out, which was, against sentencing predictions. And this was in the US, it was an offender profiling algorithm. And there were three biases that were triggered here. Overconfidence, led to the judges relying on this compass tool, even when it wasn't transparent. They assumed it was accurate. It reinforced pre-existing confirmation bias about historical crime records related to reoffence rates for African Americans compared to white defendants. And then, of course, there was a default to truth, that the system's never wrong. And we do overtrust AI. So that tendency to just accept the generated return. So for me, they took the information at face value, and it led in real terms to a much harsher sentencing for individuals that were deemed high risk. So for me, we did hear Todd talk about less is more as well yesterday, which is fantastic for the principles of communication. AI is no panacea. It forces you to tune out. My argument, I think, is really that it increases the premium and the obligation on people to tune in and to improve their judgment. So common sense applies, and it is about being more humble. It is about avoiding the bandwagon effect, and it is about not overtrusting AI. It's one input. We know what it can do. We don't yet know what it can't do. But and I think, as we heard earlier, when you disagree with it, that is the time to challenge it, which I think was very, very good advice that we heard earlier.
So I guess similarly, Noel, as you said, we don't just listen to the most senior person in the room. We don't just listen to the loudest person in the room. We don't just listen to AI, which I think is where some of that disappointment that Olivier talked about this morning too, right? Is that we use AI, and when it doesn't give us the answer that we want, we go, well, it's rubbish then, as opposed to using it as a data point. So we need to be ready to tune out AI at some point, or the outcome from AI. I want to visit the questions that we have coming in from the attendees. Do you feel that any one of your perimeters are, I know you said most bad examples are a combination of them, but do you find one of them particularly risky or particularly common? Or are they everywhere and we just need to be careful?
No, and I'll tell you why. all of them. All of them work. You can take any example, and I think it's my hobby now to actually go through any scenario, any investment decision, or even, I mean, I've analysed Theranos, for example, you know, the Elizabeth Holmes in that case, using these traps. I've analysed investment decisions, merger decisions, relationship decisions, buying cornflakes, juror decisions, by seeing does this apply to these areas. What you might find is that at a different point in your career, some might be more prevalent than others. So for example, identity seeking. So the identity traps are probably more prevalent in the early stage of your career rather than the latter stage. You might find risk-taking shifts over a time period. They're not gender, they're gender neutral. So I don't find that there is one that I would say you have to pay attention to X. The power-related ones I think are really interesting because you're always, no matter what your role is, you're either chasing power, you're trying to preserve power, or you're afraid of losing power. So they will always be always apply. Ego will always apply because you'll either have high or low ego. This isn't you always have high ego and here are your traps. Low ego traps are also traps. So I actually think, and emotion is obvious because there are 27 of them and we all have emotion all the time. So the short answer is no. Okay. I wish there was. I could just say point to this one. Yeah. The skill is to look at all of them, just to remember it's a simple mnemonic. Anyone can run through it in their head. Clients are using it. And you can use it now to test yourself. And if you feel that there's one area, then you drill down to the different biases. And then, of course, you apply the sonic solutions. So in a short answer, no.
Yeah. And, you know, any suggestions, this is coming from the chat again, do you have any suggestions on how we can make tuning in a bit of a habit in our daily lives? So maybe not for always the big decisions, but even just kind of making slightly, you know, today is all about AI. And the way we frame that is better decisions. Just if we could be incrementally better in our decisions, Nuala, any tips on making a habit of tuning in?
Yeah, I think absolutely right. I think remember the premise. I think even if you just ask yourself, am I liable to error with this? Am I listening to the right person? If you ask questions and question answers, very simple, just even those 4 words, you are tuning in differently. You need to decide that you want to tune in. There's no point. You could read every book there is on decision making. But if you haven't decided that you want, it's like going to the gym or losing weight or whatever your goal is. If you haven't decided that you want to be a better decision maker, if you haven't accepted that you are liable to any of these biases, you're not going to tune in because you don't think it's important and you don't think it matters. No. I do apply the concept of decision friction, which is about trying to slow down. So by using a series of conscious prompts or nudges or decision rules, or even just asking yourself questions, you get into the habit. And it's an excellent suggestion to just apply it to general life so that you do get into a habit of doing it. And decision friction is positive. Online friction, of course, is negative. But I think decision friction is a really simple thing that you could do. Do it in teams, appoint a decision buddy for accountability. Again, really easy ways that people can do this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nuala. We're going to try to stay tuned. For our attendees, we're going to take a 1-hour break and we will be back with John List and Eric and Ted. John List from the University of Chicago and Walmart. Have a great break.
For those of you who are on the lunch hour. Some of you are just waking up and some of you in Asia are going to bed. Thanks, Nuala. It's lunchtime in Dublin as well. Have a good break. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks very much, all.
Bye-bye.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you back in an hour.